Hey guys, King Gath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I'm going to go over how to set up what I call loopback dialogue, but in reality, the goal of this lesson is to show you how to jump around dialogue. So jump between scenes, skip over phases, go back to phases, and we're going to do that by showing you how to set up something that's very common in Fallout 4 dialogue, which is the point where you get to ask a question, and then that presents you with a bunch of new questions. And then you usually get the opportunity to ask all of those questions before you're returned back to the main tree. I think that's something so common in Fallout 4 and so pivotal to the role-playing experience that I want to show you guys how to do that. And it's going to teach you some of the stuff that you need to set up much more complex dialogue trees. So this is a pretty pivotal lesson in the dialogue system. And I'm going to try and make it straightforward and show you guys a bunch of different options, because one of the cool things is once you learn the basics of this trick, you can use it however you want. This is one of those ways. I use the phrase often. There's many ways to skin a cat. That is 100% true with dialogue stuff. So we're picking up from the dialogue quest making merged tutorial. You don't have to have gone through the quest making stuff to follow this, but that's where this is coming from. If you're wondering where this dialogue and everything is that we're working with here, I just started from a copy of that. Now off camera, I did some research on player lines, and I have our little question scene set up already. So we're going to skip some steps. I also started to do a little bit of setting up in order to get prepared and make sure all this was going to work. And so some of the steps that I'm about to show you, I'm going to not be doing them in front of you so much as showing you what I did. So all that said, let's get started. So we have this little scene here where you approach an NPC, they greet you, they threaten you, they suggest you stole their wrench, and then you have an option to start. Now in the little quest making, this was just kind of to be funny, and we just forced the NPC to give you the quest no matter what you choose. But now we're going to inject the ability to get more information about this. Now the information that we're going to offer isn't particularly useful because I didn't take a lot of time on writing this. That's not the point. I'm mostly worried about structure, but being able to at least point to specific lines and then demonstrate this in game, I had to come up with something. So when you see the questions that I offer, they're not particularly useful to the player, but that's beside the point. All right, so the first thing we need to be able to do here is we need to be able to get another one of these player selects. So if we want to give the player more options to choose, more questions, we're going to need to create another one of these player dialogue actions. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can approach this. And then the way I tend to do it is different than the way that I have set up here temporarily to show you guys, because I think most people would prefer to do it a different way than I like to do it personally. So I'm going to show you one way, and then after I show you this way, because I think this is the way most of you will prefer, then I'm going to go back and show you the way that I end up doing it. And if you were to look through Conqueror, you would see examples of this all over. So, so basically what we want to do is we want a way for this question here to jump off and go to some other direction. We want them to offer more player options. So in order to do that, we need to set up phase jumping, and that's what I call it. I don't think that's the technical term for it, but in order to jump between phases, in order to select a phase as a place you can go to, it needs to have a name. So you can see I've already named a couple of these phases, and to name the phases, you just double click them, and then there's a name up here. Now, as far as I know, the name field does not have to be unique, but I would make it your duty to make it unique, or it gets real confusing later when you try and set up scene jumps, because all of a sudden you'll just have multiple in your list that are identical. It can be really difficult to figure them out. At bare minimum, you want to make sure they're unique within each of your scenes. So I like to use, when I have a scene with multiple player choices, say the scene was going to keep going, I tend to use the PC 1, 2, 3, etc. So the first player choice that they encounter, I'll name the phase PC 1, the second will be PC 2, etc. Whatever you want to name them, it's not important. What's important is that you can follow it, because just like coders need to comment their code, you as a quest designer, you should be putting things in that are meaningful to you so that you can follow the logic quickly, because when you're coming back to bug hunt this stuff months later, it's a nightmare to go through if you weren't clear about what everything is doing. So especially when you get into more complicated stuff. So first thing you want to do is just name all of your phases, and it's just a good habit to get into. It just makes it easier when you want to start adding more complexity to your dialogue trees, is to have those phases already named. It just makes it quicker to set up the next step. So then now we've got our phases named. We next need to hit apply as soon as you do it. And if you don't do that, your phases will not show up in the select option when I show you the point where you can choose to jump between phases. But this is also just lends itself to the idea I'm always promoting, which is just frequently, hit OK on all your forms and save your plugin, just to don't risk the CK gods crashing on you. So we have our phases named, which means we could now skip between them if we wanted to. So the reason that we did it on these is because when we get our question and we offer the player the option to ask a bunch of different questions, we're going to need a way to come back to here so that they can choose one of the options that advances the quest. So we're going to do that with another scene. Now, I've already set up this scene, but you guys, if you followed this dialogue series, you know you just right-click over here and hit New Scene. So I've set up another scene over here, and this is our question. So you can see here the options are not particularly thrilling or anything, and I've already got all these phase scenes, or all these things set up to point around, and I'll explain how that works. In a second, I'll show you where you set those up, but and I'll explain what these arrows are. But you can see here, none of this is particularly important about what it says. The point is that the player has 4 different options for additional questions they can ask, and then each of them, there's an NPC response. So then what we need to do here is decide how, first of all, the player is going to get here, and second of all, how are they going to get back? How is all this going to work? So we're going to go back to our other scene, and we're going to change this guy right here. So you can do one of 2 things. You can open up the whole action, and then you get this screen, and then you can individually pick any of these and double click them. I like to work from this scene and screen instead. You can actually double click right on any of these lines and mess with them. So we can double click on this one. And the reason I'm choosing this one, this is the one that the NPC says, is because I still want, if the player chooses what are you talking about, I still want the NPC to respond before they're given the chance to ask another question. Otherwise, it'll feel very awkward. The player says, what are you talking about? And then immediately gets an opportunity to ask another question. We could do that. I mean, the game would allow it, but it would just feel wrong. So we're not going to do that. So we're going to go to here. And then basically we use something that I've showed you guys already in the greeting system. But if we go to scene, we can select our question scene we have set up, and then you'll see that the phase comes up because we named it. If we didn't name the phase, it wouldn't be available there, and then the jumping, it will probably work in that case, but if you didn't have it set up, it can get real awkward, and I find it's just safer to always name your phases and do it, and you can guarantee then that they will start correctly. I have found that sometimes I will go to start a scene, I don't select a phase, and it's not from a greeting. Greetings are an exception where they don't need a phase, but if you're not doing greetings, if we're jumping and you don't have a phase, I find this frequently doesn't work. Now, that could just be me biased towards I had a bad experience at one point and it was something else that was broken and I'm just remembering it wrong, but I know for a fact naming the phases works, so it's just a good habit to be in. All right, so the next thing you saw I checked in start scene on end. What would happen if we didn't check start scene on end is that the NPC would start speaking this line, and then the next phase would start and offer the player options. And I can't recall, it either interrupts the NPC or just lets the player choose a new option and talk over top of them. I would recommend testing it because maybe that's something you would want. Maybe you could make use of an opportunity for the player to talk over an NPC and interrupt them. Like maybe that would be useful. But in the case of this, for most normal use cases, we don't do that. So we're going to choose this. And basically what this is saying, even though it seems like it's going to be starting a new scene and we're going to be losing track of our scene, effectively this just allows you to bounce around between any point of dialogue in this quest, which is really, really useful. So the first thing you'll notice here is a little arrow appears down here and it shows you what scene that's jumping to. If you don't see these little arrows pop up, you can make sure you have this show scene links checked. For some of you guys, some of your PCs, you're going to find, or if you get into particularly complicated scenes, that having those links on can actually slow this screen down pretty badly. And so there's reason for this to be able to be toggled. I leave it on all the time, even when it's chugging my system along, just because I've learned to love those arrows. They can become quite a mess, as you probably saw on that other screen, and it gets much worse later on. So there can be times where it's useful to turn those off just from decluttering what you're looking at. Another thing you'll find when you have multiple of these arrows is you might not be able to follow them easily. Note that mine has these little white dots to help you see them. Whatever you select in here gets these little markers around it. I don't know what they're called, but I guess nodes, wherever it changes direction. But you can if you ever have trouble following one of these arrows, just make sure you click on it and it'll get the little white node so you can trace where the heck it's going to. If you also have multiple on your screen, you can also do, if you don't select it, if you just highlight it, it'll get little gray nodes as well. So your selected will have white nodes. So that's useful to know when you start getting more complicated things. Okay, so now we've got a way to jump to our question scene. So that's going to jump right to here. It's going to jump right to that phase because that's what we selected. And theoretically, one of the ways you might do this is if you had, say you were going to have a bunch of different question scenes, is you could put them all in one scene and then just jump to the right phase whenever you want to do it. That's totally up to you how you want to handle that. This is one of the power of the scene system, is it can be used to organize whatever makes sense to you. Or maybe it makes sense to you to have every time you add a new question, you set up a whole new scene just for it. It's totally up to you. So now you can see we have one of those screens with all these different arrows on it. And if you look closely, you'll see that several of the arrows, and it's hard to tell because, again, this is, like I said, it's kind of a cluster, and this is where it's very useful to be able to highlight or select things. You'll see that effectively 3 of the arrows are pointing right to this gray box, and then one of them is pointing back to this one. So whenever you see the gray box down at the bottom, which is like what we see here, oops, that means it's going to a different scene. When you see it going to a gray box within the same scene, it means it's jumping to that phase in that same scene. We've taken advantage of that fact and allowed these dialogue, whenever the NPC is speaking these, after they're finished, it's going to take them right back to this option. So that's how you do the thing you've seen in the game many times, where you get an opportunity to ask multiple options in a dialogue wheel as opposed to only getting one and then it proceeds. This is how you do that. You basically just have the NPC's response. If we go in here, you make them jump back to the same exact phase. So even though we're still in, so this is why I think the idea or the naming of this as start scene is a little misleading. That's why I call it phase jumping, because that's, to me, that makes more sense of what we're actually doing. We're not actually starting a scene. The scene's already running, but this is how you set it up. It's under the start scene section. So we're going to the same scene, to the same phase, and we're gonna hit start scene on end, and then you'll see an arrow will appear to here. So for the positive option, the neutral option, and the question option, we're bringing it right back to here. So then that makes the negative option, or the if you're using a controller, the B button, that's naturally what feels like go back to me. So that's how I chose to do that. Again, you could do this however you want. You could make the positive option go back. You could make instead the positive option skip right to the give quest instead of making it go back to player choice 1. This is the power of the phase mechanic and how you can bounce it around however you want. You can make pretty much any dialogue line go to any phase in any scene within the same quest, and that within the same quest is very important. You can't jump between different quests. Unfortunately, there's been times where I wanted to be able to do that. There's probably I know there is a sort of way to pull it off, and I'll show it eventually, but it's really complicated and I've had it break on me, so I don't tend to use it ever. But I will probably eventually cover that. So, and just know with this dialogue stuff, there's so many more things we can cover with this. We are hardly done as far as Bethesda Mod School goes. This is an important one, and you guys have to get this down before I can show you some of the more complicated stuff you can do. All right, so we've got our question is taking us over to this question scene. 3 of the questions loop back, and then one of them, you can see here, it's going to KG Dialogue Gath Starts Quest. PC1, so it starts, the Gath starts quest, and dash PC1 meaning to this phase named PC1. So it's basically jumping them back to here. Now if they choose any of the other options, it's going to just advance left to right. So that's another important thing to note from this. Once you start introducing these, is that at any time, if there's no arrow directing somewhere else, it's just going to go one after the other. Now there are ways to bypass that. We can set up conditions. We can set up another thing, an action type called start scene, which makes where you can set up forking within the action system. There's so much more we can do. Like there's way more we can do, and we're going to cover it in other tutorials. But for now, just want to focus on how you set up phase jumping between scenes right now. So just note that in general, things go left to right unless there's an arrow pointing you to go somewhere else instead. And that leads to the way that I normally set this up. Now, before we jump to that, I just want to make sure that we are clear here and that everybody understands exactly what's going on. We could right now go into the game and play through this. Now, I don't have the audio file set up. We skipped setting up the player prompt. So if you look at here, we've got the second line. So you've got this is what the player says. This is what the player chooses from in the dialogue wheel. We don't have that set up here. So all this would look terrible, but it would work. It would do what we expect it to do. So as long as you guys have that clear and you're good to go, this is the way a lot of you will probably like to set it up. Personally, I'm just going to show you an alternative because in the in the spirit of many ways to skin a cat, you can do these things many different ways. The way I tend to do this sort of thing is I will set up all of my stuff in the same scene, and that's just, for me, it's easier to visualize. I don't like having to jump between when I'm trying to get my head wrapped around how a scene is playing out, or having to keep jumping back and forth between screens. I would rather be able to like do something like this and zoom out and see it all, even if it's a big mess of arrows. That's just how I like to do things. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it, because I think it's useful to have multiple ways to do it, because there will probably be, at some point, you're going to come up to some corner case where jumping scenes is just not tenable. It's just not going to work for your particular use case. So what I like to do here is I will put these choices right in a row. So you can actually do a cool thing here, which is insert phase before, and that will inject a little phase in the middle here. So then I'm also going to show you guys something cool, is that you can copy paste actions. Now I will warn you, when you copy paste actions, all of these like scene links you have are going to get real funky. So just be aware of that. When you do it, you're going to need to fix all of them. So we're going to go ahead and right click that and hit copy action. We're going to come in here and we're going to paste it in. So this is, and so like if we look at here where these are pointing, I don't know if they're necessarily pointing to the correct place. So we're going to just manually fix all of them just to make sure that they're not going somewhere weird. Like I think all of them are taking us back over to that question scene, which we don't want. So in general, if you copy paste actions, no, you're probably going to have to fix all the links. All right, so first thing we're going to do, just following suit on what I said earlier, is let's get in the habit of just always naming our phases. So we're going to call this PC2. Another way we might name this is we could say PC1 question phase, because this is still kind of the same player choice in the dialogue scene. It's up to you guys. You get whatever makes sense to you. Personally, I like to just do PC1, PC2. It just makes it real easy for me to understand, so I can correspond when I'm looking at this list of phases in this drop down here, that I can correspond it in my head to what I'm looking at. If I just think about it from this, that's just how my mind works. So up to you how you want to name those. All right, so then in this case, so instead of jumping this guy to a scene, now we're just going to let this advance as normal because it goes left to right. So we just change this to none and uncheck that. So now this is naturally going to fall into here. Now we got a problem though, because all of these are also going to go left to right. So we need to now skip those. So we're going to need to skip phase 2, and we do that by going to start quest and choosing give quest. And now we will see an arrow appears. And if we hover over it, you see the little gray dots. Where we click it, get the little white dots. You can trace it, and it goes to give quest. So it's going to skip over our PC2, and we would repeat that for all of these. Now some of you might be thinking, well, wouldn't it be easier to put the question on the other side of the give quest, and then that way we only need to have one scene jumping instead of 3 of them? And yeah, you're correct. That could be another way you could do it. Again, this is just my preference in it, but this is the power of this system and how versatile it is in what you want to do. You can do whatever makes sense to you. You should organize it in a way that's pleasing to you, that you can follow. But I am gonna demonstrate what that would look like, only because it shows another cool little trick we can do. So let's go ahead and insert phase before again, even though we don't need that. But one of the things you can do with actions, you can actually drag and drop them, which is really powerful. So we could do something like that, rename this phase, make this one the gives quest. But we'll see. So like, let's just set that up just for the sake of giving you guys a thorough demonstration here. So now we have these 3 go straight to here. This guy we want to skip over to phase 2. Or PC2 rather. Oop. And so we see our first problem here because I failed to hit apply. It's not detecting them. We just basically threw a wrench in things by adding more phases. So you got to remember to hit that apply. But we're also going to rename this guy. So we're going to call this quest end example, and then we'll go ahead and apply. So now we need to, with this one, we want to switch. We need to skip over to PC2. And you'll understand why I'm going through all this trouble of demonstrating all these different methods in a moment. All right, so now we've got that. Awesome. I know we haven't fixed these links yet. We'll do that in a minute. So now these 3 are going to go to here. They're going to give the quest. So now we have another problem. We still have left to right. So now we're still going to end up in a situation where now these go to player choice 2, which we don't want. So to fix that, on here, we're going to hit end running scene. And now what that does is as soon as this happens, as soon as that line's finished, then it just cuts the scene off and won't go any further. So that stops the left to right. One of the reasons that I don't like doing it that way, even though it makes the scene links cleaner, is I like to always I don't like using end running scene unless I absolutely have to. For me, end running scene I tend to only use if you're going to have the player do something negative or just tell the NPC, no, I'm not doing that. Otherwise, I like to always have my where all the dialogue meets and it's ending and we're giving the quest or whatever. I like that to be the very last thing. It just feels better. It just looks nice and organized to me. So that tends to be how I do it. So let's restore all this back to how we had it, and then we'll fix these links. And then, so we're going to set this up. I want to go back to setting it up the way I like to do it, because that was the whole point of this little exercise. So we can uncheck our end running scene here. We can get rid of this link because they're now next to each other, left to right flow. And then we need to restore these guys back so that it follows suit. So give quest. And one other thing, I'm going to actually hit apply here and make sure that it gets rid of that other extra phase out of our list. Yep, there it goes. And then our last one here, starts quest, give quest. Okay, so now we've got our start scene, gives quest. Rather. All right, so now those three are pointing to here. This guy is just going to go left to right. So now we need to fix these guys. So let's change all of these ones. Instead of having them jump to the question scene, we're going to go right back to ourself. We want to go to PC2 because we want these options here. We said we want the cancel button or the negative to go back to PC1. The rest are going to go back to themselves. So if we click on this teal one now, it's pointing to the phase 2 box, the upper one, not these ones down here, which means we've got that set up correctly. We'll skip over to this one. Again, same thing. We want this to be PC2. And now you can see one of those little gray boxes down at the bottom there disappeared because now this option, the yellow option, is correctly pointing to this little box here. And then we'll go and do this last one. We want PC2. Okay, so now all of those things down at the bottom, everything that was jumping us to the question scene, those are all gone. Now the last thing we have to do is make sure this is getting us back to PC1, which it already is. So that happened to carry over when I copy pasted, but we can see it goes back to PC1. So now we can say, are we done? They respond, can I have my wrench? And then you get back to these options, and then you would have the option to say one of these other three in order to proceed to receiving the actual quest. So again, this what we just did here works exactly the same as our previous example that was set up like this. What I assume is most of you guys are going to be like, you know what, this first way you have it set up is way cleaner. This is just way easier to look at. All these things, I only have to see them if I click over here. This one was less of a mess. This just looks like a train wreck. Personally, this is just how I like it. I envision it more like that. Like that to me is like, okay, I understand this conversation is flowing. This is my second questions, etc. All up to you, whatever feels right to you, however you like to organize, you get to make those decisions. It's a very powerful set of tools. And once you understand that it's all about just naming phases and setting up these arrows to make the dialogue flow how you want, to me, it's super simple. It's very easy to understand that logic. It made, once that clicked for me, this whole dialogue system was a cakewalk. And then the rest of the stuff that I'm going to show you dialogue-wise, outside of that, like you could pretty much do 90% of quest dialogue using just using those jumps around. Now, the next pieces that we need to talk about, I think, in this are going to be things like conditions, like maybe you want them to only say something, you know, if you're wearing a certain piece of gear or if you've done a certain quest in the past, things like that. That would be a big one as conditions. And then also we haven't talked about how to have NPCs talk to each other yet, which is a big cool thing I'm loving doing. We've been doing that a ton in Conqueror, where we've got 4 or 5 NPCs in conversation, and it feels really cool. It feels like a cutscene, and that's something else I want to cover as well. All sorts of little topics I have around dialogue I want to show you guys, but I think this is one of the most important ones because it lets you do branching dialogue. It lets you offer the player more options, and once you understand that jumping between scenes like this and how powerful that is, it lets you organize your stuff in a way that'll help you to have this flow better in your mind. Because one of the issues with a lot of this writing, it's just visualizing this, is like, how are you going from, because this isn't the same as writing a story where you're just linearly going through it. The player gets to weave through this, and so you have to be able to visualize this and understand what it is you're allowing them to do and make sure it matches what you want them to do without having to pop in the game and test every single time you make a little tweak. But that being said, I'm going to go ahead and set all of this up, demonstrate it in game so you guys can see that it works in this particular setup here in my crazy mess of a scene. All right, we're in game. Here's our character. Don't mind all the spam in the corner there from all the mods I left installed for some reason. Wait a second. Aren't you the one who stole my wrench? All right, so we're going to go ahead and go to our what are you talking about option?
What are you talking about?
That wrench you have. Looks exactly like the one I lost this morning. And here's our secondary options. So as long as we don't say, are we done, this should just present all the options, and the ones we've selected already should be grayed out. So
Why
let's
do
try
you
that.
think it's my fault?
Well, You got a wrench there, and I don't have mine. Plus, you look really guilty. And there we go. So it's grayed out. So let's do the others.
Are you sure?
I don't see anyone else with a wrench in their pocket. That happens to be the exact color, size, and shape of the one I'm missing.
What if I knew someone who could help you?
You do know someone who can help me. You.
Are we done?
Can I have my wrench? And then you get back to the previous options where we can say...
You're right. I'm sorry.
Well, that's all right. Can I have it back? I know how you can make this right. I've got a lead on another. Go fetch it for me. So, obviously, none of my dialogue made any sense there for why you would offer it back, say, I'm sorry, and then you get the quest. But that's not the point. The point was we now have the ability here to set up a secondary set of questions, allow the player to ask all of them, and then it goes back to the original dialogue scene. So hopefully this is something you guys can make a lot of use of and do some much more complicated scene work now that you've got that little trick. Now, if you guys run into additional questions or want me to cover specific parts of the dialogue scene system, definitely comment that below and I'll make sure that those get added to my list of future tutorials. I have probably another dozen that I can dream up already for dialogue and scene work because, again, it's such a deep topic and there's some really complicated things you can do if you want to get into really advanced stuff, but I want to always do things from a foundational basis. I'm going to be starting with the lower level stuff first to give you guys as many tools as possible in your toolboxes that are universally useful, and then we'll get to the more niche stuff that's going to be useful just in certain scenarios. But thank you guys for watching, and good luck with all of your quest mods.